The most powerful conversations begin where words can no longer reach. The dinner rush always sounded the same at Bellamy House. Silverware chimed against porcelain, glasses caught the warm glow of chandeliers, and conversations blended into a steady hum that made every evening feel rehearsed. I moved through the dining room with practiced caution, balancing a tray of sparkling water as though one wrong step could shatter more than crystal. At 26, I had learned that people rarely noticed a waitress unless she made a mistake. That suited me just fine. Quiet people survive by becoming invisible. My name tag read Lily Carter, though most customers never looked closely enough to read it. They smiled, ordered, thanked me, and forgot I existed before dessert arrived. I preferred it that way. Attention had never brought anything good into my life. VIP reservation arriving in 5 minutes, my manager whispered, smoothing his tie for the third time. His normally cheerful face had turned pale. Everyone stay sharp. No mistakes tonight. The entire staff exchanged nervous glances. Someone in the kitchen muttered that the guests owned half the city. Another server quietly asked to switch sections. No one volunteered to take table 12. I looked toward the empty booth near the fireplace, wondering what kind of family could make an entire restaurant nervous before they even walked through the door. Then the front doors opened. The room didn't fall silent, but it felt quieter somehow. Conversations softened. Heads turned without meaning to. 4 men in tailored dark suits entered first, scanning the dining room with calm, professional eyes before stepping aside. Behind them walked a man who looked no older than his early 30s. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. Confidence surrounded him like invisible gravity. His charcoal suit fit perfectly. His dark hair was neatly combed back, and every measured step suggested someone accustomed to people making room without being asked. Beside him walked an elegant older woman with silver hair pinned neatly behind her ears. Her expression was gentle, almost distant, her eyes studying the room with quiet curiosity instead of suspicion. Something about her immediately felt different from everyone else at the table. My manager exhaled slowly. "Lily," he said, placing a careful hand on my shoulder. "You're taking table 12. I blinked. Me. Everyone else is occupied. We both knew that wasn't true. Before I could answer, he gave me an encouraging nod and disappeared toward the kitchen. I picked up 4 menus, steadied my breathing, and walked toward the family. The younger man briefly met my eyes. His gaze was calm, unreadable, lasting no more than a second before he gently pulled out a chair for the older woman. She thanked him with a warm smile, but no sound followed. Instead, her delicate fingers moved gracefully through the air, forming signs I recognized instantly. My heartbeat skipped. I hadn't seen American Sign Language outside community classes in years. As the others sat down and began speaking among themselves, she remained quietly disconnected from the conversation, smiling politely whenever someone remembered to look her way. I tightened my grip on the menus. For a moment, memories I had spent years trying to fold away came rushing back with perfect clarity, and before I could stop myself, I took one slow breath, stepped beside her chair, and gently raised my hands. My fingers hesitated for only a heartbeat before memory took over. I smiled at the elegant woman and signed, "Good evening. Welcome to Bellamy House. I hope you are having a wonderful evening." Her eyes widened with unmistakable surprise. For a second she simply stared at my hands as though she could not believe what she was seeing. Then her face softened into the brightest smile I had ever witnessed. She answered with graceful movements, "Thank you, dear. It has been a very long time since someone greeted me first instead of waiting for my son to explain." My chest tightened. That sentence carried years of quiet loneliness inside it. I signed back without thinking, "It is my pleasure. Would you like sparkling water or still water tonight?" She laughed silently, the corners of her eyes crinkling with genuine joy before choosing sparkling water. I barely noticed that the rest of the table had stopped moving. The room around us continued with its gentle rhythm of clinking glasses and quiet conversations, but table 12 existed inside its own pocket of silence. I looked up and found the younger man watching me with an expression I could not read. His sharp features remained perfectly composed, yet his eyes had changed. They were no longer politely observing a waitress. They were studying me as though I had unexpectedly rewritten the rules of the evening. One of the older gentlemen leaned toward him and whispered something I could not hear. The younger man never looked away. Instead, he quietly asked, "You know American Sign Language?" His voice was calm, almost careful. I nodded. "Yes, sir. I learned years ago." I did not offer more because some stories belong to the heart before they belong to strangers. He glanced toward his mother. She was already signing another question to me, asking what dessert I liked most on the menu. I answered, and she laughed again, this time covering her mouth with one hand like a delighted child discovering an old friend. The sound never reached the room, but somehow everyone at the table felt it anyway. I noticed the younger man's shoulders relax by the smallest fraction. It was such a tiny change that most people would never have seen it. I almost missed it myself. As I handed everyone their menus, his mother gently touched his sleeve and signed several quick sentences. He watched her hands before looking back at me. For the first time since entering the restaurant, the guarded distance in his face gave way to something unmistakably human. "My mother says," he began quietly, "that this is the happiest start to a dinner she has had in years." I felt warmth rise into my cheeks. "Please tell her I am honored." She did not wait for him to translate. She had already understood my hands before I finished the sentence, and the grateful look she gave me carried more meaning than any spoken words ever could. Across the dining room I sensed curious eyes drifting toward our table, but I paid them no attention. I had come to work another ordinary shift. I had no idea that a simple conversation spoken without a single sound had already changed the course of all three of our lives. The rest of the evening unfolded around table 12 as though the restaurant itself had begun breathing more slowly. Every time I returned with another course, Eleanor welcomed me with another warm smile and another question in American Sign Language. She wanted to know which soup the chef enjoyed most, whether the flowers in the lobby were real, and if I had always lived in New York. None of the questions were extraordinary, yet each answer seemed to brighten her expression a little more. I realized she was not searching for information. She was enjoying something far simpler. She was finally included in the conversation instead of watching one happen around her. Ethan rarely interrupted. He answered business calls with quiet efficiency whenever his phone vibrated, but each time he slipped it back into his pocket, his attention drifted toward his mother instead of the screen. I caught him watching the easy rhythm between us more than once. His normally composed expression softened each time Eleanor laughed without making a sound. It was the kind of smile that reached every corner of her face, the kind that could not be rehearsed or purchased. When I returned with dessert, Eleanor signed another question before I could even place the plates on the table. She asked if I had time to teach her the proper sign for chocolate lava cake, because she wanted to surprise the pastry chef. I laughed quietly and showed her. She practiced twice before proudly repeating it back to me. The chef happened to walk by just then, and she signed the words exactly as I had shown her. His eyes widened before he applauded with a delighted grin, and several nearby guests smiled without even understanding why. It was impossible not to smile back. As I stepped away, I heard one of Ethan's associates say in a low voice, "I have not seen your mother this happy in years." Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched Eleanor thank me again with another graceful movement of her hands. Only then did he quietly reply, "Neither have I." Those 4 words stayed with me long after I disappeared into the kitchen. During my short break, I poured myself a glass of ice water and tried to slow my heartbeat. My coworkers surrounded me with whispered questions. They wanted to know whether the powerful family had been demanding or difficult. I surprised myself by shaking my head. "No," I answered honestly. "They are just a son who loves his mother." Even as I said it, I realized that was the only part of Ethan I truly understood. Titles, wealth, reputation. None of those had appeared while he watched Eleanor smile. For a few quiet moments, he had simply looked like a man grateful to see someone he loved feel seen. When my break ended, I walked back toward the dining room carrying a fresh pot of coffee. Before I reached the table, Ethan stood from his chair. Every conversation nearby seemed to pause for an instant as he stepped into my path. His expression remained calm, but there was unmistakable sincerity behind his steady eyes. "Miss Carter," he said gently, "before my family leaves tonight, my mother would like to ask you something important." For a brief moment I forgot every other table waiting for refills. I looked past Ethan to Eleanor, and she was already smiling at me with patient eyes that carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime communicating without sound. She lifted her hands and signed slowly enough for me to follow every word. "Would you sit with me for 5 minutes after your shift? I would love to hear your story." No customer had ever asked me that before. Most people wanted recommendations or quick service. They never wondered who I was after I walked away with an empty tray. I smiled and signed back that I would be honored if my manager approved. Eleanor clapped her hands together softly in delight before thanking me once again. Ethan watched the exchange carefully, saying nothing until I excused myself to continue serving the dining room. The next 2 hours disappeared in a blur of orders, coffee refills, dessert plates, and smiling faces. Yet every time I glanced toward table 12, I found Eleanor practicing new signs with quiet determination. Sometimes she waved happily when she caught me looking. Each time, I answered with another small smile before returning to work. By the time the last guests began leaving, the restaurant had settled into the peaceful stillness that always followed a busy evening. My manager surprised me by walking over with an expression I could not quite read. "Table 12 already settled the bill," he said quietly. "They also left something for you." He handed me a folded cream-colored envelope. I immediately shook my head. "If it is an oversized tip, I cannot accept anything beyond company policy." He smiled. "Open it first." Inside was not money but a simple handwritten note on thick stationery. The elegant handwriting read, "Thank you for giving my mother a night she will remember. There is no debt between us. Only gratitude. Ethan Romano." I read the sentence twice before carefully folding it again. Somehow those words felt heavier than an envelope full of cash. As I slipped the note into my apron pocket, I noticed Eleanor waiting near the front entrance while the others prepared to leave. She beckoned me over with a warm smile. We sat together on a small bench beneath the restaurant's chandelier, while the staff quietly finished cleaning around us. She asked how I had learned American Sign Language. My fingers slowed as memories I rarely shared drifted gently back into my heart. I told her about my younger brother, Noah, who had lost his hearing after a severe illness when we were children. We had learned every sign together because I never wanted him to feel alone in a room full of people who could hear. Eleanor listened with glistening eyes, never interrupting. When I finished, she reached out and gently squeezed my hand before signing something I would never forget. "Love always finds its own language." Standing a few feet away, Ethan remained perfectly still. He had come looking for his mother, but instead he had quietly witnessed a truth that no background report or private investigation could ever reveal. The following week unfolded exactly as every other week had before, or at least that was what I kept telling myself. I arrived before sunset, tied my apron, greeted the kitchen staff, and memorized the evening specials. Yet every time the front door opened, some small part of me glanced up without meaning to. I always reminded myself that people like Ethan Romano belonged to a world completely separate from mine. One extraordinary evening did not erase that distance. On Thursday, just after 6 o'clock, the familiar black sedan stopped outside the restaurant. I noticed it only because several guests turned toward the windows at the same time. A moment later, Ethan stepped inside alone. No large group. No formal dinner. No visible urgency. He simply nodded politely to the hostess and requested a table for one. My manager looked at me with a knowing smile before quietly assigning me to his section again. I approached with my usual menu and greeting, determined to treat him exactly like every other customer. "Good evening, Mr. Romano." He smiled politely. "Good evening, Miss Carter." His voice remained calm, but there was a warmth in it that had not been there before. He ordered grilled salmon, black coffee, and nothing else. During the meal, he spent more time reading a hardcover biography than looking around the dining room. The image did not match the intimidating reputation people whispered about outside those walls. When I refilled his coffee, he closed the book for a moment. "My mother has practiced every new sign you taught her," he said. "She has been correcting my hand movements all week." I could not help laughing. "She learns quickly. She says it is because someone finally made learning joyful again." His words lingered with me long after I walked away. The following Tuesday he returned. This time Eleanor came with him. She proudly greeted me entirely in American Sign Language before I even reached the table. Her movements were more confident now, and every successful sentence filled her with quiet pride. We spent only a few minutes talking because other guests needed my attention, yet those few minutes seemed to become the highlight of her evening. Week after week, the visits continued. Sometimes Ethan came alone for lunch. Sometimes he brought his mother for dinner. Sometimes they stayed less than an hour. Sometimes they lingered over coffee while Eleanor practiced new expressions and laughed whenever she accidentally signed the wrong word. I never expected gifts, promises, or dramatic gestures. They never asked me to become anything other than the waitress who remembered to see the person everyone else unintentionally overlooked. One evening, as I cleared their dessert plates, Eleanor looked at her son with an affectionate smile before signing something that made him lower his eyes with quiet embarrassment. Curious, I looked toward him. He cleared his throat and gave the smallest smile I had ever seen. "My mother says this restaurant is no longer her favorite because of the food," he admitted softly. "She says it is because her favorite teacher keeps showing up for work every evening." For reasons I could not explain, those simple words stayed with me all the way home, and for the first time in many years, the silence inside my small apartment no longer felt quite as lonely. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the city with crisp air and golden afternoons, and somehow the Romano family had become part of the rhythm of my ordinary life. Then, on one unusually busy Friday evening, something unexpected caught my attention. I was carrying a tray of fresh coffee toward the private dining room when I noticed two well-dressed men standing near the entrance. They appeared to be waiting for someone, but instead of speaking aloud, they began communicating with one another in American Sign Language. That alone was not unusual. What stopped me was the urgency in their movements. Years of practice with my brother had taught me that emotion often lived in the speed and precision of every sign. Their conversation was hurried, careful, and filled with repeated references to a family dinner, an unexpected visitor, and a change that had to happen before everyone arrived. I slowed my pace without making it obvious, naturally passing close enough to catch another sentence. One of the men signed that the original venue had changed, and that no one outside the family was supposed to know until the last minute because too many people had been asking questions about the gathering. The other nodded and replied that Mrs. Romano must leave through the garden entrance instead of the main lobby because the schedule had already been leaked to several unfamiliar people. Neither man looked threatening. They simply looked concerned, as though they were trying to prevent confusion before an important family celebration. Even so, I felt a quiet responsibility settle over me. The information clearly mattered, and I knew Ethan would want to confirm that everyone had received the updated plans. A few minutes later, Ethan entered the restaurant to pick up his mother after another enjoyable dinner. Eleanor greeted me with her usual bright smile, proudly signing an entire sentence without hesitation. While she admired a seasonal flower arrangement near the entrance, I politely asked Ethan if I could speak with him for a brief moment. He immediately noticed the seriousness in my expression and stepped aside with me, never appearing impatient. I carefully explained exactly what I had observed and repeated the signed conversation word for word, making it clear that I did not know the full situation and did not want to misunderstand what I had seen. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression becoming thoughtful rather than alarmed. When I finished, he thanked me sincerely and made a quick phone call to verify the details. Within minutes, one of his associates confirmed that an updated schedule had indeed been prepared, but that several members of the extended staff had not yet received the revised instructions. Because the message had reached Ethan in time, Eleanor was guided through the correct entrance without unnecessary confusion, and the family gathering continued exactly as planned. Ethan slipped his phone back into his pocket and looked at me with quiet appreciation. "Most people would have assumed it was none of their business," he said softly. "You chose to make sure my mother was not inconvenienced." I smiled gently. After everything she has shared with me, she feels less like a customer and more like someone I genuinely care about. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing at all. Then, with the faintest smile, he nodded as though he had just discovered that kindness could be every bit as powerful as influence, especially when it came from someone who never expected anything in return. Several days later, Bellamy House hosted a private charity dinner supporting programs for children with hearing loss. The dining room glowed beneath crystal chandeliers, soft piano music floated through the air, and every table was decorated with white roses donated by local families. It felt less like a formal event and more like a celebration of quiet hope. Eleanor had personally invited me to attend for a few minutes before my shift began, insisting that I meet several volunteers from the community where she had recently started practicing American Sign Language every week. Watching her confidently greet strangers with graceful movements filled me with a happiness that was difficult to describe. She no longer waited for someone else to interpret the world for her. She walked into it herself. As guests continued arriving, I noticed Ethan standing near the entrance speaking with organizers, thanking sponsors, and making certain every family felt welcome. Despite his reputation, he moved through the room with remarkable patience, stopping to shake hands with elderly couples, listening carefully to parents, and kneeling for a moment so a little boy could proudly show him the first signs he had learned. It was a side of him that few people outside this room would ever believe existed. During the evening, Eleanor invited me to join her table for dessert after my responsibilities were finished. I hesitated, but my manager smiled and quietly encouraged me to accept. The moment I sat down, Eleanor signed an introduction to every guest at the table. She described me not as a waitress, but as the young woman who had reminded her that silence could still be full of friendship. My eyes filled with emotion before I could stop them. No compliment I had ever received compared to those simple words. Ethan noticed my reaction and offered a reassuring smile that carried genuine kindness rather than obligation. After dessert, the event organizer stepped onto the small stage to thank everyone for attending. Before concluding, she surprised the audience by inviting Eleanor to say a few words. Eleanor walked forward calmly, standing beneath the warm lights without fear. She spoke through American Sign Language while an interpreter voiced her message for the audience. She shared how one unexpected evening had changed her confidence and reminded her that being understood was one of life's greatest gifts. Then she looked directly toward me and signed, "Sometimes angels wear aprons instead of wings." The room answered with heartfelt applause, but I barely heard it. I was too overwhelmed by the sincerity shining in her eyes. As the guests slowly began leaving, Ethan approached me near the entrance. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, "You believed you were simply serving dinner. My mother believes you gave her back a part of herself that she thought was gone forever." I lowered my eyes, unsure how to respond. He continued quietly, "Some people leave an impression because they ask for attention. You never asked for any, and somehow you changed every room you entered." Standing beneath the soft glow of the restaurant lights, I realized that the greatest moments in life often arrived without applause, growing silently inside ordinary evenings until they transformed strangers into something that felt remarkably close to family. Winter arrived with clear skies and sharp morning air, yet the warmth I associated with the Romano family never seemed to fade. My days still began with tying my apron and greeting familiar faces, but somewhere along the way, Bellamy House had become more than the place where I earned a paycheck. It had quietly become the place where unexpected friendships continued to grow. One evening, after the last dinner guests had finished dessert, Ethan asked if I had a few minutes before heading home. His voice carried the same calm confidence it always had, but there was something unusually thoughtful behind it. We stepped onto the restaurant's quiet terrace where tiny white lights reflected across the river beyond the city. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence felt comfortable instead of awkward. Finally, Ethan looked toward the water and smiled faintly. "Do you know what surprised me the most?" he asked. I shook my head. I spent years believing that every problem could be solved with influence, planning, or resources. Then you walked into my mother's life with nothing except patience and kindness, and you accomplished something that none of us had managed in years. I lowered my eyes, unsure how to respond. I only spoke the language she already understood. He slowly shook his head. "No, you did something much greater." He turned toward me, his expression completely sincere. "You reminded her that she deserved to be included, before she deserved to be accommodated. There is a difference, and somehow everyone else missed it." His words settled quietly into my heart. I thought about Noah, about the afternoons we had spent practicing signs at our kitchen table, laughing whenever I mixed up the alphabet. Back then I believed I was simply helping my little brother feel less alone. I never imagined those childhood moments would one day shape someone else's family. Ethan continued speaking with the honesty of someone finally putting long-hidden thoughts into words. "The night you greeted my mother without hesitation," he said softly, "was the night I realized strength is not measured by the room that becomes silent when you enter. It is measured by the person who feels seen because you arrived." Neither of us looked away. There was no dramatic declaration, no promise that belonged only in stories. There was simply mutual respect built one quiet evening at a time. Before we returned inside, Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his coat and handed me a small envelope. "This is not a gift," he explained before I could refuse. "It is an invitation." Inside was a handwritten card from Eleanor, asking if I would consider volunteering with her at a new community program where children learning American Sign Language could practice with families every Saturday morning. At the bottom she had signed one simple sentence in careful handwriting. "Every family begins with one conversation." I smiled so brightly that I could almost hear Noah laughing beside me again. Looking up, I found Ethan watching my reaction with quiet gratitude. And in that peaceful moment I understood that the most meaningful promises in life are often made without anyone saying the words out loud. 1 year later, Saturday mornings no longer belong to sleep or routine. They belong to laughter expressed through moving hands, bright smiles, and patient hearts inside the Community Learning Center where Eleanor's dream had quietly become a reality. Families from every corner of the city gathered there to learn American Sign Language together. Parents practiced with children. Brothers signed with sisters. Grandparents laughed at their own mistakes before trying again. Every lesson reminded me of afternoons spent beside Noah, never realizing those simple moments would someday ripple far beyond our little home. Eleanor greeted every new family at the entrance with the confidence of someone who had rediscovered her own voice. She no longer hesitated before introducing herself. She welcomed strangers with graceful movements, encouraging every nervous beginner with the same kindness she had once shown me. Watching her transform from someone who quietly waited for conversations into someone who joyfully created them remained one of the greatest privileges of my life. Ethan often arrived carrying boxes of books, learning materials, and hot coffee for the volunteers. He never made speeches or sought recognition. Instead, he quietly arranged chairs before classes began, stayed afterward to stack tables, and listened patiently whenever parents shared stories about their children overcoming fear one sign at a time. Somewhere along the journey, the distance between our worlds had disappeared without either of us noticing exactly when it happened. We had never forced trust. We had simply earned it through countless ordinary moments. One afternoon after the final class ended, a little girl ran toward Eleanor and carefully signed, "Thank you for helping my grandmother talk to me." Eleanor looked at the child with shining eyes before gently pointing toward me. The little girl turned and wrapped her small arms around my waist. "Miss Lily," she said aloud, "Grandma says kindness has its own language." I felt tears gather before I could stop them. Across the room, Ethan watched the moment quietly. When our eyes met, he smiled with the same calm warmth I had first seen on the evening his mother laughed without making a sound. As everyone prepared to leave, the three of us stood together near the windows where golden afternoon sunlight filled the room. Eleanor reached for both of our hands and signed one final sentence. "Family is not always the one you are born into. Sometimes it is the one that grows every time someone chooses to understand another heart." Neither Ethan nor I answered with words. We simply signed the same reply together. "Thank you." In that peaceful silence, I finally understood that the greatest miracles rarely arrive with noise or applause. They begin with one small act of compassion, one person willing to truly see another, and one quiet conversation that changes every life it touches forever.